The first snow arrived over Blackmere Hollow with the quiet certainty of something long expected and faintly dreaded. By mid-afternoon, the village had become a painting composed entirely of softened edges, slate rooftops powdered white, crooked chimneys breathing pale ribbons of smoke into the iron-colored sky, and narrow hedgerows vanishing beneath slow drifts that gathered silently across the lanes. Even the church bell sounded altered by the weather, its distant toll muffled as though wrapped in wool. Winter always changed the village. It slowed conversation, it shortened tempers, it drew curtains earlier, and encouraged old memories to return uninvited. But there was another reason the villagers watched the coming of winter with peculiar unease. It was the season when Eleanor Ashcombe disappeared. The carriage emerged precisely at 4 o'clock from the gates of Ashcombe Manor, just as it had every December for nearly 12 years. The horses moved carefully over the frozen road while snow spiraled around the wheels in ghostly bursts. No servant accompanied the widow. No farewell was exchanged at the gate. And yet people watched. Not openly, of course. Blackmere Hollow possessed the refined discretion peculiar to English villages, where curiosity survived beneath layers of politeness so polished they resembled virtue. Curtains shifted. Shopkeepers lingered too long arranging displays. A postman paused beside the war memorial, without letters in his hand. Everyone noticed. No one spoke. Inside the bakery on Chapel Lane, Mrs. Finch stopped kneading dough long enough to glance through fogged glass as the carriage passed. "Off again," she murmured. Her assistant crossed herself unconsciously. At the Blackmere Inn, conversation dimmed for precisely 7 seconds before carefully resuming. The interruption itself felt rehearsed, part of a ritual the village had performed year after year. By evening, snow had thickened into a fine, relentless curtain drifting across the roads and swallowing the surrounding moors. Lamps glowed amber behind cottage windows, while wind pressed softly against old stone walls. Near the inn's fireplace sat Miss Marple. At first glance, she appeared entirely unremarkable, a white-haired elderly lady wrapped in a sensible coat, her gloved hands folded neatly over a handbag that looked older than some marriages. Yet there was an alertness about her pale eyes that unsettled people once they noticed it. She observed quietly in the manner of someone accustomed to discovering far more than others intended. She had arrived only that afternoon to visit an old acquaintance recovering from influenza. The weather, however, had trapped her at the inn for the evening, which suited her perfectly well. Miss Marple enjoyed villages in winter. Cold weather had a curious tendency to loosen secrets. The innkeeper, Mr. Pritchard, poured tea with unnecessary care. "Nasty roads tonight," he remarked. "Yes," said Miss Marple gently, "though I imagine Mrs. Ashcombe is accustomed to traveling this time of year." The innkeeper's hand paused almost invisibly. It was a very small hesitation. But then, Miss Marple had built much of her understanding of human nature upon small hesitations. "Oh, Mrs. Ashcombe always goes away in winter," he said lightly. "Health reasons, I believe." "Does she indeed?" One of the locals nearby leaned closer to the fire. "They say she keeps a gentleman in Brighton," he muttered. "Nonsense," another replied. "It's a private asylum. My cousin's husband delivered parcels there once." "You're both wrong," said a third quietly. "Old Matthew Reed swears she paid someone off years ago after that business with the boy." A silence followed. Not awkward, fearful. The kind of silence villagers create around subjects they have discussed too often in private. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "And what does Dr. Harwood say?" she asked. The effect was immediate. Relief moved subtly through the room like warm air. People trusted Dr. Julian Harwood. In villages, such trust often became stronger than evidence itself. As though summoned by mention alone, the doctor entered moments later, brushing snow from his dark overcoat. He carried himself with polished ease, handsome in the restrained manner of men who age into authority gracefully. His voice possessed that rare quality capable of calming anxious people before he had even spoken more than a sentence. "Ghastly weather," he said warmly. Introductions were made. Harwood greeted Miss Marple with effortless charm. "You've arrived during our bleakest season, I'm afraid." "Oh, I rather like winter," Miss Marple replied. "One notices things more clearly." Something flickered behind his smile, then disappeared, only briefly. Conversation turned naturally toward Eleanor Ashcombe. Harwood dismissed speculation with the patient amusement of a physician tolerating childish gossip. "Mrs. Ashcombe has endured delicate health for many years," he explained. "The winters are difficult for her nerves. People tend to romanticize suffering in villages." His tone was kind, perhaps too kind. Miss Marple noticed that while speaking, he never once referred to Eleanor as Mrs. Ashcombe after the first sentence, only Eleanor, as though familiarity had long ago become entitlement. Outside, the snow deepened. By 10 o'clock the inn had fallen quiet, save for the occasional crackle from dying embers. Miss Marple retired upstairs carrying a candle that trembled faintly in the draft-filled corridor. Her room overlooked the distant rise where Ashcombe Manor stood beyond bare elm trees and iron gates. Even through snowfall, the manor possessed an austere grandeur. Vast, dark windows, steep roofs burdened with white, chimneys exhaling smoke into the bruised sky. A lonely house, the sort of house that absorbed sorrow and preserved it. Miss Marple paused before closing her curtains. Something had changed. At first she thought it merely a trick of weather and shadow. Snow blurred distances strangely at night. Yet after several seconds, she realized the movement had been unmistakable. One of the upper curtains inside Ashcombe Manor shifted gently aside, then closed again. Miss Marple remained perfectly still. The widow had already departed. The servants, according to Mr. Pritchard, had been dismissed for the season. The manor should have been empty, yet someone was inside the house, and whoever stood behind that curtain had been watching the road below. Chapter 2. The House of Quiet Rooms. Morning arrived over Blackmere Hollow with a kind of reluctant light, as though the sun itself had to negotiate with the weather before emerging. The snow had not ceased during the night. Instead, it had deepened its hold on the village, softening the edges of fences and hedges until everything appeared gently erased and rewritten in white. Ashcombe Manor, seen from a distance, looked less like a residence and more like a memory, refusing to fade. Miss Marple walked there slowly. She did not hurry. Haste, in her experience, belonged to people trying not to think. The lane toward the manor was narrow and bordered by old trees whose bare branches interlocked above her like skeletal fingers. Every few steps she paused, not from difficulty, but from attention. There were patterns in villages that revealed themselves only when one moved at the correct pace. Too fast, and they remained hidden. Too slow, and they changed shape. At the iron gate, she noticed the first oddity. No footprints leading inward. Only faint impressions of wheels, recent yet partially erased by overnight snowfall. The carriage had left, yes, but the absence of any returning track suggested something more precise than routine departure. Someone had taken care to ensure the road forgot what it had seen. The door to Ashcombe Manor opened before she reached it. The housekeeper, Mrs. Lorne, stood framed in the doorway with the expression of someone who had been interrupted mid-thought for several years and had never fully resumed it. Her hands were red from cold, her apron too neatly tied, as though order itself was an act of persuasion. "Oh," she said, startled. "I didn't expect visitors." Miss Marple offered a gentle smile. "I hope I'm not intruding. I was passing and thought I might inquire after Mrs. Ashcombe." A hesitation, a fraction too long. "She is away," Mrs. Lorne said carefully. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "I heard she travels each winter." The housekeeper's eyes flickered, almost imperceptibly. "Yes, every winter." There was something rehearsed in the repetition. Not a lie exactly. Villages rarely sustained lies for long, but a sentence repeated often enough to become indistinguishable from truth. Inside, the manor carried its silence like architecture. The corridors were wide and dim, lined with portraits of people who no longer appeared to belong to the same emotional world as the house itself. Dust did not settle here carelessly. It seemed arranged. Even the clocks, Miss Marple noticed at once, were synchronized too precisely, as though time had been disciplined into obedience. Mrs. Lorne led her into a sitting room where the fire burned low despite the cold. "She does not like disorder," the housekeeper said suddenly. "Mrs. Ashcombe?" "Yes." Another pause. "Or Eleanor." The use of the first name seemed to slip out before permission had been granted. Miss Marple took a seat near the window. From here, the garden stretched outward, buried beneath snow that had erased the distinction between path and lawn. "And where does she go each winter?" she asked gently. Mrs. Lorne's hands tightened slightly on her apron. "I believe she visits a place where she can rest." "Ah, she is unwell in winter," the housekeeper added quickly, as if correcting something not yet spoken aloud. Miss Marple nodded, though her gaze had drifted elsewhere. On the mantelpiece stood a small photograph. A boy, perhaps 6 or 7, holding a paper lantern. His expression was bright, unaware of being remembered. The frame had been polished recently, too recently for a house supposedly in abandonment. "Your son?" Miss Marple asked softly. Mrs. Lorne's face tightened. "Mrs. Ashcombe's. Thomas." The name lingered in the room like something delicate and dangerous. "I see," Miss Marple said. Yet she did not look at the photograph as much as she looked at the way Mrs. Lorne avoided it. Grief, she knew, rarely avoided its own symbols, unless it had been instructed to do so. A knock interrupted the moment. Dr. Julian Harwood entered, as though he had been expected by the house itself. Snow clung to his shoulders, melting slowly into dark fabric. His presence altered the atmosphere immediately, not by force, but by familiarity, the kind of man who belonged in rooms before anyone decided to invite him. "Miss Marple," he said warmly, "I was told you were visiting. I hope you are not finding things too dreary." "On the contrary," she replied, "I find them rather instructive." His smile held, though slightly more measured than before. "I assure you, there is nothing mysterious here. Mrs. Ashcombe simply requires medical care during the winter months, a predictable condition." "Predictable?" Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, emotional fragility often follows seasonal patterns." He spoke as though describing weather rather than a person. Mrs. Lorne excused herself quickly, leaving the room with the relief of someone escaping a conversation they had been trained to endure rather than participate in. When she was gone, Harwood lowered his voice slightly. "Villages tend to create stories where there are none," he said. "It helps them feel involved." "And you believe there is no story here?" "I believe there is only illness," he replied gently. "Everything else is imagination." Yet Miss Marple noticed something subtle. He did not ask why she had come. He already knew she would ask. The sitting room felt suddenly narrower. Miss Marple rose slowly and walked toward the window. Outside, the snow had begun again, fine and patient. "Strange," she said. I noticed no luggage when Mrs. Ashcombe departed. Harwood's reflection remained steady in the glass. It is sent ahead, he replied. Ah, she said again, but there was no confirmation in her tone, only observation. On a small table near the window sat a ledger. Not quite hidden, not quite displayed. Miss Marple noticed its placement immediately. The careful neutrality of objects meant to be seen but not examined. She did not open it. She only observed Harwood's brief glance toward it, a glance too quick to be careless, too precise to be innocent. When she finally took her leave, the house seemed to exhale slightly behind her. Outside, the wind had shifted, carrying a faint metallic coldness from the moor. Mrs. Lorne closed the door without meeting her eyes. The walk back to the village should have been uneventful, yet Miss Marple found herself pausing halfway down the lane. Something had changed in her understanding of the manor, not dramatically, but structurally. The house was not empty in winter. It was rearranged, rooms unused, objects repositioned, time artificially stabilized. A place not abandoned, a place maintained in absence, as though someone expected its owner to return exactly as she left, without deviation of mind, without deviation of memory. At the inn that afternoon, conversation was subdued. Snow had deepened further, isolating Blackmere Hollow from the wider world. People spoke in lowered tones, as if sound itself might disturb something delicate. Dr. Harwood had already returned to his duties at the clinic. Yet Miss Marple learned something new from an unguarded remark made by the innkeeper's wife while serving tea. "She always comes back in March," the woman said absently. "Same as ever, pale as a ghost, but herself again." "Always?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Oh yes, like clockwork." A pause. Then, almost as an afterthought, though last year she arrived 2 days later than usual, Dr. Harwood said she'd lost track of time. The words should have meant nothing, yet Miss Marple felt them settled differently. Lost track of time. Not illness, not recovery. Time itself. That evening, as darkness folded over the village once more, Miss Marple stood by her window again. Ashcombe Manor was visible only as a silhouette against the snow-heavy sky. No light showed in any window, and yet she remembered the curtain moving, not as illusion, not as weather, but as intent. She lowered her candle slightly, watching the distant house with quiet concentration, and then she understood something that made her breath pause, not in fear, but in the recognition of pattern finally revealing its shape. Eleanor Ashcombe did not simply leave every winter. She was being removed, and someone inside that silent house was still keeping track of her absence with unsettling precision, because on the manor's upper floor, a light flickered once behind a curtain and stayed there. Chapter 3. The Chapel on the Moor. The snow did not soften Blackmere Hollow so much as it redefined it. By morning, the village had become an arrangement of muted shapes, chimneys exhaling pale breath into a sky that seemed unwilling to commit to either light or darkness. The roads were quieter now, not from lack of movement, but from the sense that movement itself required permission from the weather. It was in this subdued world that the discovery was made. A shepherd from the eastern moor, a man accustomed to solitude and therefore less frightened by it than most, had gone out early to check his boundary fences. He returned before noon without his sheepdog, and without his usual indifference to gossip. He went straight to the inn and said only one sentence before sitting down heavily by the fire. "There's a woman in the chapel." At first no one understood him. Then understanding arrived in fragments. Then silence followed, not as disbelief, but as recognition of inevitability. Miss Marple heard of it an hour later. She did not hurry, she never did. but there was a stillness in her movements now that suggested attention had sharpened into something more deliberate. The kind of attention that gathers details the way winter gathers snow, layer upon layer until the familiar becomes unrecognizable. The chapel stood on the moor like a thought abandoned mid-prayer. Old stone, partially collapsed roof, a bell tower that leaned slightly as though listening to something beneath the ground. In summer it was forgotten. In winter it became unavoidable. The path toward it had not been properly cleared. Snow lay unevenly across it, disturbed in places by hurried passage. Miss Marple noticed this immediately, though she said nothing. Inspector Graves arrived shortly after she did, his coat dusted with frost, and his expression already resigned to whatever truth the moor intended to reveal. Inside the chapel, the air was colder than outside, not metaphorically, physically colder, as though the building held a pocket of winter more concentrated than the landscape around it. And there she was, Eleanor Ashcombe. She lay near the altar, her figure composed in a way that did not immediately suggest struggle. One hand rested slightly outward, fingers half curled as though she had been interrupted mid-thought rather than mid-life. Her coat was neatly fastened. Her hair, though damp with frost, remained carefully arranged. It was the stillness that disturbed Miss Marple most. Not death, stillness that felt arranged. A single candle stood beside her, burned low yet strangely undisturbed by wind. Inspector Graves muttered something under his breath, already reaching for explanations shaped like official statements. Exposure, distress, probably wandered. But Miss Marple was not looking at him. She was looking at the candle, then at the altar, then at the floor beneath Eleanor's hands, and at the faint marks in the snow that led inward, only inward, not outward. She knelt slightly, not touching, only observing. The snow inside the chapel had not melted uniformly. There were patches where it had been disturbed, compressed, then partially smoothed again. Not by nature, by intention. "Inspector," she said quietly, "may I ask something?" Graves sighed. Of course. Was there any sign of struggle outside? A few tracks. They stop here. And return? He hesitated. No. Miss Marple nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something she had been expecting. But her gaze drifted again, not to the body, but to the candle. It had not guttered, which meant it had been shielded, which meant someone had stayed close enough to protect it from the wind. A strange act for a tragedy. A human act. Reverend Boone arrived while they were still examining the scene. His breath came unevenly, as though the cold had unsettled more than his lungs. When he saw Eleanor, something crossed his face too quickly to be grief alone. Recognition, and then concealment. "I should have closed the chapel," he murmured. Miss Marple turned slightly. "You knew she might come here?" A pause. Too long. "I knew she used to come here," he corrected softly, "in previous winters." "Used to?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, his eyes fell to the candle, and something in his posture tightened. Inspector Graves noticed none of this. Or if he did, he filed it away in a mental drawer marked "clerical unease" and moved on. But Miss Marple observed how Reverend Boone's hands moved when he was uncertain, not shaking, protecting, as though he feared what might be seen if they remained still. Outside, the wind shifted suddenly, pressing snow through broken stained glass. A pale beam of light fell across Eleanor's face for a moment, illuminating it with a clarity that made the room feel briefly more intimate than it should have been. Miss Marple studied her carefully. There was something inconsistent about the scene, not in a dramatic sense, in a human sense. Eleanor did not look like someone who had wandered into death. She looked like someone who had arrived expecting resolution and had found something else instead. Later, when the body was being prepared for removal, Miss Marple stepped outside into the biting air. The moor stretched around her like a silent witness, refusing to comment. Inspector Graves joined her, exhaling sharply. "Nothing suspicious so far," he said. "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, but her tone suggested she did not agree. Graves glanced at her. "You think otherwise?" "I think," she said carefully, "that people rarely die in places they do not intend to be." He frowned. She was elderly, distressed. "It's not uncommon, Inspector," she interrupted gently. "Did you notice the candle? A votive candle in a chapel, hardly unusual." "No," Miss Marple said. "Its position," Graves hesitated. "I noticed it was placed beside her." "Yes," she said. "Not near her, beside her." A silence followed, one of those silences that begins to stretch meaning rather than absence. Reverend Boone approached them then, his expression composed once more, though carefully so, like a man adjusting a mask that no longer fits comfortably. "I should inform you," he said quietly, "that Mrs. Ashcombe has no reason to be here. She was unwell, likely wandered in confusion." Miss Marple studied him. "Wandered," she repeated softly. "Yes, and yet," she said, almost conversationally, "the tracks outside suggest she did not wander into the chapel so much as she was brought here. A flicker, very brief. Then control returned." "That is speculation," Boone said. "Of course," Miss Marple agreed. But she did not stop watching him, because Reverend Boone had made one mistake. A small one. He had looked not at the body, but at the entrance of the chapel, as though expecting someone else to arrive, as though Eleanor Ashcombe was not the only person missing from the story. As they prepared to leave, snow began falling again, with renewed intensity, erasing footprints almost as quickly as they were made. The chapel gradually disappeared behind a veil of white, as if reluctant to remain visible at all. Miss Marple paused at the gate. Something had not yet settled in her mind. A discrepancy, a pattern that refused completion. Then she remembered the shepherd's words. "There's a woman in the chapel. Not a body, not a death, a woman." As though she had still been alive when first discovered, and in that moment Miss Marple felt the first true unease of the case. Not fear, but recognition that the story being told aloud was not the same story the village was living, because someone had arrived at the chapel before the shepherd, someone had arranged the stillness, and someone had left before the body was found, leaving only one set of tracks that returned into the snow. Chapter 4. The Child Beneath the Ice. The news of Eleanor Ashcombe's death moved through Blackmere Hollow with the peculiar inevitability of winter thaw, slow, quiet, and unsettling in its certainty. It did not arrive as shock so much as confirmation of something long anticipated but never openly acknowledged. At the bakery, conversations paused mid-sentence and then resumed in softer tones. At the inn, chairs were turned slightly inward, as though people needed to physically adjust themselves to accommodate the idea. And at Ashcombe Manor, the windows remained shuttered. No smoke rose from the chimneys that morning. No movement disturbed the curtains. Only snow gathered against the iron gate, slowly erasing the last visible signs that a carriage had ever passed through there. Miss Marple walked into the village square just after noon. She noticed immediately how grief in such places did not behave like grief in cities. It was not loud nor expressive. It was organized, contained, almost administrative in its acceptance. People did not ask what had happened. They asked instead how long it would be before things returned to normal. as though death were an inconvenience in routine. At the inn, the fire burned low and steady, and conversation had settled into a strange historical mode. People no longer speculating about Eleanor Ashcombe's life, but rearranging her past into something more narratively satisfying. She was never quite right after the boy, someone said. The boy, someone else repeated, as though the phrase required no explanation. Miss Marple sat by the window, listening without appearing to listen. It was a skill she had refined over many years, the ability to let words pass through her like weather, while retaining only those fragments that clung to structure. "The boy," she said softly at last. An older man near the fire nodded. "Thomas, poor child." The room shifted subtly, not emotionally, but socially, as though a door had opened onto a memory the village preferred to keep half closed. "It was winter then as well," the man continued. "Christmas, if I recall correctly." "Accidents happen," someone muttered. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed gently. "They do." But her eyes were distant now, not in abstraction, but in reconstruction. A child, ice winter, and a woman who disappeared every year during the same season. Patterns rarely repeated without reason. In villages, repetition was rarely coincidence. It was ritual disguised as habit. Dr. Julian Harwood entered shortly after, bringing with him the faint scent of antiseptic and cold air. He removed his gloves with deliberate calm, greeting those present with the same composed warmth that had become almost a signature. Yet Miss Marple noticed something subtle. His eyes did not immediately search for comfort, they searched for information. "Such a tragedy," he said softly. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "It is." A pause. Then Harwood added, almost carefully, "She never truly recovered from Thomas's death." The name hung between them, not new, but newly weighted. Miss Marple studied him. "Tell me," she said, "how old was the boy?" Harwood blinked once. 6, perhaps 7. And it was here? In the village? Yes. The frozen pond behind the eastern fields. "Ah," she said, "only that." But something in her tone made Harwood glance at her more sharply. The village, sensing tension, fell quieter. Outside, snow began to fall again, heavier this time, as though the sky itself had decided the subject required further obscuration. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked alone toward the eastern fields. The path was less traveled here, not abandoned, but remembered only intermittently. Hedgerows bowed under the weight of snow, and the landscape stretched outward in pale undulations that erased distance and depth alike. The pond lay ahead like a sheet of dull glass, frozen, still, unyielding. For a long time she simply stood there, not thinking in the usual sense, but aligning fragments of narrative the way one might align broken glass to reconstruct a window. A child had died here, and every winter Eleanor Ashcombe left the village. At first it had been explained as illness, then nerves, then treatment, but explanations, Miss Marple knew, were often less about truth than about making truth socially tolerable. Behind her, footsteps approached carefully, not hurried, measured. She did not turn immediately. "I thought I might find you here," Dr. Harwood said. "You were not mistaken," she replied. He joined her at the pond's edge, his gaze following hers toward the frozen surface. "Strange place," he said quietly. "Memory clings to it." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Water does that. It remembers shape even when it forgets movement." A faint smile crossed his face, though it did not reach his eyes. "You speak as though it is alive." "In a sense," she said, "it is. Everything retains what has been impressed upon it long enough." Silence followed, not uncomfortable, measuring. Then Harwood spoke again. "You are thinking about Thomas. I am thinking about patterns." Miss Marple corrected gently. A pause. "And what pattern do you see?" he asked. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she stepped slightly closer to the pond's edge. "Tell me," she said, "was anyone else present when the child fell?" A hesitation, a fraction too small to be accidental. "The records say he wandered alone," Harwood replied carefully. "Yes," she said. "Records often prefer simplicity." The wind moved across the ice, carrying a faint, hollow sound beneath its surface, a memory of movement trapped beneath stillness. Miss Marple's gaze remained fixed. "And yet," she continued softly, "it is strange that a child would be left unattended during a gathering on Christmas Eve." Harwood's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "There was a family argument," he said. "Emotional distraction. It happens." "Yes," she agreed again. But now her tone had changed. Slightly. Not sharper. Colder. "Tell me," she said. "Who found him?" Another pause. Longer this time. "A groundsman," Harwood said at last. "Matthew Reed." The name settled into the air like something unwanted. Miss Marple turned her head slightly. "Ah," she said, "the same man who once worked at Ashcombe Manor." Harwood looked at her more directly now. "Yes? And was he close enough to reach the pond quickly?" "I believe so." Miss Marple nodded slowly, as though the answers were not surprising, but were arranging themselves into something inevitable. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. "Dr. Harwood, do you remember where Mrs. Ashcombe stood when the child fell?" A stillness, a careful recalibration of expression. "That was many years ago," he said. "Yes," she agreed, "but some things are remembered precisely because they were witnessed." For the first time, Harwood did not answer immediately. The wind pressed against the frozen pond, and beneath its surface the ice seemed to hold a depth that did not belong to water alone. At last he said, "She was not far." Not an answer. An admission of proximity without responsibility. Miss Marple exhaled softly. "I see," she said, and now she understood why the village narrative had remained so stable for so long. Not because it was true, but because it was shared. That evening, as she returned toward the village, Miss Marple felt the shape of the case begin to shift. Eleanor Ashcombe's winter disappearances were not absence, they were containment, and someone, carefully, consistently, patiently, had been guiding that containment for years, not for protection, but for control. As she reached the edge of Blackmere Hollow, she noticed something unusual near the churchyard gate. A small cluster of villagers stood quietly, speaking in hushed tones. Among them was Reverend Boone, and as Miss Marple approached, she heard the final words of their exchange carried faintly on the wind. "They never recovered the child's coat," Boone was saying. Miss Marple stopped. The coat had never been mentioned before, and in that moment, with winter pressing silently around the village like an enclosing hand, she realized something that made the world feel briefly narrower. Not only had something been lost beneath the ice that day, something had been removed afterward, deliberately, carefully, and never returned. Chapter 5. The Sanatorium Name. The winter deepened in a way that no longer felt like weather, but like persistence. Blackmere Hollow did not simply endure the cold, it adapted itself around it, reshaping daily life into smaller, quieter movements. Doors were opened less often, conversations shortened. Even the sound of footsteps on snow seemed hesitant, as though the ground itself required reassurance before allowing passage. At Ashcombe Manor, the shutters remained closed, not in mourning, in maintenance. Miss Marple observed this from the village road one late afternoon. standing where the lane curved just enough to reveal the distant silhouette of the house without fully exposing it. There was something about it now that felt subtly wrong, not in structure, but in rhythm. A place that should have fallen into stillness after death, yet had instead settled into something more deliberate, preserved absence. She walked toward it again, not out of impulse, but out of necessity formed slowly over days of observation. Inside the manor, nothing had changed visibly since Eleanor Ashcombe's death, yet Miss Marple had learned that in certain households, change was never visible in objects. It lived instead in arrangement, how things were placed, how time was distributed, how silence was managed. Mrs. Lorne answered the door again, though her expression had altered slightly since last time. There was a fatigue in her eyes now, not of exhaustion, but of instruction followed too long without questioning. "She's not here," the housekeeper said automatically. "No," Miss Marple agreed gently, "she is not." A pause. Then Miss Marple added, "I wondered if I might see the winter accounts. For charitable records, of course." Mrs. Lorne hesitated. It was not refusal. It was memory searching for permission. "Dr. Harwood manages those," she said finally. "Ah," Miss Marple replied, but she did not leave, because that name had become in recent days less a person and more a structural explanation for everything the village could not otherwise reconcile. Dr. Julian Harwood, a man who seemed to stand at the intersection of every uncertainty. When Mrs. Lorne finally brought out a ledger, it was done with the careful reluctance of someone revealing something already too often concealed. The pages were neat, meticulous, almost tender in their orderliness. Miss Marple did not open it immediately. She simply observed it. Paper rarely revealed truth quickly, but it revealed patterns easily. "I believe Mrs. Ashcombe spent time away every winter for treatment," Miss Marple said softly. "Yes," Mrs. Lorne replied. "Where exactly?" A pause, longer than expected. "A private facility," the housekeeper said at last. "Near the coast." Miss Marple looked up slightly. "Do you know its name?" The hesitation this time was different. Not uncertainty, avoidance. "It changed names often," Mrs. Lorne said. "That is inconvenient," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Yes," the housekeeper agreed, but her voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple turned a page in the ledger, and then another, and there it was, not prominently placed, not emphasized, but consistent. A recurring payment reference, Harwood Residential Care Trust. Miss Marple did not react immediately. She had long learned that reaction often interfered with understanding. Instead, she allowed the name to settle. Harwood. Not a medical note, not a facility. A structure, a continuity. Behind her, Mrs. Lorne shifted slightly. "She was always delicate in winter," the housekeeper said quietly, almost defensively. "The doctor said so." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "Doctors often observe patterns." She closed the ledger carefully, then asked, almost conversationally, "And where did she go exactly?" "To rest," Mrs. Lorne repeated, but this time the phrase sounded less like truth, more like rehearsal. That evening, Miss Marple returned to the village inn. The fire was stronger now, battling against the encroaching cold, yet even warmth felt temporary, as though it existed only on lease. Dr. Harwood was already there. Of course he was. He always seemed to arrive where explanations gathered. He stood speaking with Reverend Boone near the hearth. Their conversation was low, measured, and carefully shaped around topics that did not invite scrutiny. But Miss Marple had learned that what men avoid saying is often more revealing than what they choose to speak aloud. She sat nearby without intruding, and listened. "She had episodes every winter," Harwood was saying gently. severe enough that she required supervision. Supervision, Boone repeated, almost reluctantly. Yes, structured care prevented further decline. Boone nodded, but uneasily. And the child's death, Boone said after a pause. You still believe that was the trigger? I do, Harwood replied calmly. The phrasing was precise, not sorrowful, clinical. Miss Marple noticed how Boone's fingers tightened around his glass at the mention of the child, a man resisting memory, or responsibility. Then Boone said something that shifted the air in the room. She never spoke of it in confession after a certain point. Harwood looked at him. Never? Not for years, Boone said quietly, as though something had changed in what she remembered. A silence followed, a meaningful silence. Miss Marple felt it immediately, not as emotion, but as alignment, pieces settling into positions they had been moving toward all along. Memory had changed, not faded, changed. She rose slowly and approached the fireplace. Forgive me, she said gently, but I was under the impression Mrs. Ashcombe's winter absence was for treatment. Harwood turned to her with his usual calm warmth. Yes, he said, and this treatment was always the same? Broadly. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And always arranged through you? A fraction of pause. Yes, he said, not defensive, not evasive, simply factual. But Miss Marple noticed something else now. The certainty with which he answered was not natural recall. It was repetition. She stepped slightly closer. And this facility, she continued, Harwood Residential Care Trust, is that correct? For the first time, something altered. Not his expression, his stillness. A micro-adjustment in posture that most would not notice. But Miss Marple did. Yes, he said again. But now the word carried weight it had not carried before. Miss Marple studied him carefully. Curious name, she said, almost as though it belongs to the person arranging it rather than the place itself. A faint smile. Measured, controlled. It is a charitable trust, Harwood replied, named for convenience. Of course, she said, but she did not look convinced. Boone, sensing tension, excused himself quickly, retreating into the safer distance of ritual obligation. The inn's atmosphere shifted subtly as he left, as though one stabilizing element had been removed. Miss Marple remained standing. Harwood did not move. Outside, snow pressed harder against the windows, and then Miss Marple said something very softly. Tell me, doctor, where is this facility located? A pause, long enough to be noticed, short enough to be concealed. Near the coast, he said again. Which coast? This time, he did not answer immediately, not because he did not know, but because the answer required construction, and construction required thought. When he finally spoke, it was careful. North Devon. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. I see, she said. But she did not see agreement. She saw alignment breaking, because something had not fit for some time now. The ledger entries, the village phrasing, the repetition of identical explanations across years. And now, the name, Harwood Residential Care Trust. Not a place, a person embedded in structure, a system designed not only to treat, but to contain. Miss Marple lowered her gaze briefly. When she looked up again, her expression had changed, not dramatically, but decisively. I wonder, she said quietly, how often Mrs. Ashcombe actually left the village at all. A stillness followed, the kind that does not fill space, but removes it. Harwood's voice, when it came, remained calm. She left every winter. Yes, Miss Marple agreed softly, then added, almost gently, or perhaps she was made to believe she did. The fire crackled sharply, a log shifted, and in that moment, Something in Dr. Julian Harwood's expression finally stopped behaving like performance. Not entirely, but enough. Enough for Miss Marple to understand that she had reached the edge of something carefully maintained for a very long time, and that beyond it was not simply truth, but design. Chapter 6. The Shape of Kindness. By the 6th week of winter, Blackmere Hollow had ceased to behave like a village and begun to resemble a memory repeating itself incorrectly. Snow no longer felt like an event. It felt like continuation. Roofs disappeared beneath it, as though they had never been designed to withstand visibility. Paths reformed overnight, only to be erased again by morning wind. Even voices seemed altered, lowered not by courtesy, but by instinctive caution, as though speaking too clearly might disturb something already delicately arranged. Miss Marple had long since learned that in such conditions, people revealed themselves more easily than in summer. Cold stripped away ornamentation. What remained was structure, and structure, she knew, rarely lied. She walked through the village that morning with no particular destination, or rather, with many small destinations that only revealed themselves as she moved. Each conversation, each glance, each hesitation forming part of a larger pattern she was still learning to read. At the grocer's, Mrs. Finch spoke too quickly when Eleanor Ashcombe was mentioned. At the post office, letters addressed to Ashcombe Manor were returned unopened with unusual regularity. At the church, Reverend Boone avoided the chapel door entirely, and always, beneath these small movements, there was the same invisible figure shaping the narrative without ever appearing fully within it. Dr. Julian Harwood. He was not present in the street that morning, yet his presence was everywhere in absence, in explanations already prepared, in phrases already softened, in truths already domesticated into acceptability. Miss Marple stopped briefly outside the inn. Through the frost-laced window, she could see him speaking to a group of villagers. His posture was relaxed, his expression attentive, his voice carefully modulated to match whatever emotional need stood before him. Comfort here, reassurance there, a slight nod where uncertainty might otherwise grow. He did not impose himself upon people. He aligned himself with them. That, Miss Marple knew, was far more effective. Inside, she did not join the group immediately. Instead, she observed from a distance, as she often did, allowing the shape of interaction to settle before entering it. And then she noticed something small, almost invisible. Harwood never allowed silence to remain unoccupied. If one person stopped speaking, he immediately filled the gap, not with urgency, but with guidance. A gentle correction, a reassuring explanation, a reframing. Silence in his presence did not exist, which meant, Miss Marple thought quietly, that silence must be something he could not tolerate or could not afford. She entered then, lightly, as though arriving late to something already in motion. The conversation adjusted around her without disruption. Polite acknowledgement, slight repositioning. The village always accommodated newcomers, especially those who appeared harmless. Harwood greeted her with measured warmth. "Miss Marple, I hope the weather has not been too oppressive." "I find it rather clarifying," she replied. A faint smile. "Yes, I imagine you would." There was a pause, not uncomfortable, observational. Then Miss Marple said, almost casually, "I have been thinking about Mrs. Ashcombe's winter arrangements." A subtle shift occurred in the room, not dramatic, but collective, as though several people had unconsciously straightened their posture. Harwood inclined his head. "Of course." "She seemed," Miss Marple continued gently, "extraordinarily consistent in her absence." "Yes," he said. Her condition followed a predictable cycle. "And yet," she added, "people in predictable cycles rarely require such elaborate management." A flicker, very brief, Then calm. "Medical cases differ," Harwood said smoothly. "Yes," she agreed. "They do." She took a seat now, though not directly facing him, more to the side, a position that allowed observation without confrontation. "I wondered," she said, after a pause, "whether she ever expressed reluctance to leave the village in winter." A silence followed, not immediate, measured. "She understood the necessity," Harwood replied at last. "Necessity," Miss Marple repeated softly. "Yes. And who explained that necessity to her?" Another pause, shorter this time. "I did," he said. "It was not said proudly, nor defensively. It was said as fact. And in that moment, Miss Marple understood something she had been circling for days without yet naming. Control did not always present itself as force. Sometimes it presented itself as continuity." She nodded slightly. "I see." Outside, snow began falling again. Thicker now, less like weather, and more like accumulation of unspoken things. Harwood stood. "I must attend to the clinic," he said politely. "If you will excuse me." "Of course," Miss Marple replied. But as he moved toward the door, she spoke again, gently. "Dr. Harwood?" He paused. "Yes? You speak of Mrs. Ashcombe's condition as though it belongs entirely to her." A faint stillness. "But I wonder," she continued, "how much of it was shaped by the person treating it." For the briefest moment, something in his composure did not adjust correctly. Not collapse, not break, misalignment. Then it corrected itself. "I assure you," he said calmly, "her condition was not induced." "Induced," Miss Marple repeated softly. "An interesting word." He offered no reply, and then he left. The room exhaled slightly after his departure, as though everyone present had unconsciously been holding breath without realizing it. Conversation resumed, but differently now, less confident, more fractured, as though a single structural support had been temporarily removed, and no one was certain how long the building would remain stable without it. Miss Marple remained seated. She watched the fire. Then quietly, she said to no one in particular, "He is very careful, isn't he?" A villager nearby hesitated. "Yes," they said, "he always has been." "And people trust him easily?" "Oh, yes," came the reply. "He has done so much for the village." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. But her gaze had shifted inward now, toward thought rather than observation, because she had seen this pattern before. Not in this village, but in others. A person who becomes essential to explanation eventually becomes essential to reality itself. And once that happens, reality begins to adjust itself around them. That evening, Miss Marple visited Reverend Boone. The vicarage was colder than expected, though not from lack of heating, more from emotional restraint, the kind of place where warmth was permitted only in controlled quantities. Boone greeted her with visible fatigue. "I assume this is about Mrs. Ashcombe," he said quietly. "It is," Miss Marple replied. He led her into the study, where books lined the walls in careful symmetry. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Miss Marple said, "You mentioned confession recently." Boone stiffened slightly. "Yes, and you said Mrs. Ashcombe stopped speaking of her son after a certain point." He nodded. "Do you remember when that change occurred?" Boone hesitated. "Yes," he said finally. "It was after she began seeing Dr. Harwood regularly." The words were simple, but the implication was not. Miss Marple looked at him carefully. "After she began seeing him," she repeated. "Yes," a pause. "And before that?" "She spoke often," Boone said quietly. "Of guilt, of the accident, of the ice." Miss Marple's gaze did not move. "And after?" Boone swallowed. "Nothing," he said, as though the memory had softened. "Softened," Miss Marple repeated. But Boone shook his head slightly now, as though correcting himself. "No," he said more quietly. "Not softened." A pause. Rewritten. The word hung in the room longer than expected. Miss Marple did not respond immediately, because now the pattern was no longer fragmented. It was forming coherence. And coherence, in cases such as this, was often the most dangerous stage of understanding. She rose slowly. "Thank you," she said gently. Boone looked at her with unease. "Miss Marple, what exactly do you think is happening?" She paused at the door, then replied with quiet precision. "I think," she said, "that someone has been ensuring that Mrs. Ashcombe's grief never had the opportunity to become memory." And as she stepped out into the cold evening air, she finally understood what had been hidden in plain sight all along. Not that Eleanor Ashcombe disappeared every winter, but that every winter she was made to forget why she should not. Chapter 7. The Winter Ritual. The wind changed that night. It did not announce itself with violence, but with adjustment, subtle at first, as though the village had been turned slightly on its axis while no one was looking. Snow began falling in thinner, sharper patterns, driven sideways across lanes that had already been erased once that week. Blackmere Hollow felt, for the first time in many days, unsettled in its own structure. Miss Marple noticed this immediately. She always noticed when patterns began to deviate from their own rhythm. Inside her small rented room at the inn, the fire burned low, not for lack of fuel but for lack of attention. She sat near the window, hands folded, watching how the snow collected on the sill in uneven layers, some compacted by wind, others untouched, delicate as ash. Her thoughts were not hurried. They rarely were at this stage of understanding. Instead, they arranged themselves quietly, like objects being placed on a table one by one until their relationships became unavoidable. Eleanor Ashcombe did not leave. She was processed. The thought, once formed, did not feel dramatic. It felt precise. Downstairs, the inn had settled into evening silence. The kind that villages produce not through emptiness but through collective restraint. Even laughter, when it occurred, sounded rehearsed. Miss Marple descended shortly before 9. She did not intend to overhear anything specific. She never did. But she understood that truth, in such places, often emerged in the spaces between intention. At a corner table, Dr. Harwood sat alone, not isolated, positioned. His presence in the room was subtle but complete, like a system operating without visible machinery. People occasionally passed him, exchanged brief words, received brief reassurance, and moved on slightly altered in mood. He did not appear to be working, yet everything around him suggested maintenance. Miss Marple did not approach immediately. Instead, she ordered tea and observed. It was Reverend Boone who arrived first, moving hesitantly through the room as though unsure whether he belonged in public spaces anymore. When he saw Harwood, his expression tightened in a way that suggested familiarity mixed with reluctance. They spoke quietly, not openly. Constructed, Miss Marple caught fragments as she allowed herself to appear distracted. She had another episode. Same cycle. No deviation from pattern. Harwood's voice remained calm throughout, almost instructional. Boone, however, seemed increasingly unsettled. "I do not understand how it can be so consistent," Boone murmured at one point. Harwood's reply was immediate. "Because it has been conditioned." The word hung. Conditioned. Not illness, not fate. Conditioned. Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. Behind the language, she could sense structure tightening. Boone lowered his voice further. "And the memory loss, it is always temporary?" "Always," Harwood said. A pause. Then Boone said something softer. "And she believes it each time?" "Yes," Harwood replied. No hesitation. As though belief were not an emotional state, but a managed outcome. Miss Marple's gaze lifted slightly. Now she stood and approached, not suddenly, not intrusively, but as though arriving at a point already under discussion. "Forgive me," she said gently, taking the seat beside them. I could not help overhearing. Harwood looked at her without surprise. Boone looked at her with something closer to relief. "Miss Marple," Harwood said calmly, "I find myself curious," she continued, "about this cycle you both refer to." A brief silence. Then Harwood nodded slightly, as though accommodating a known variable. "Mrs. Ashcombe suffers seasonal dissociation," he said. "It has been managed for years." "Managed," Miss Marple repeated. "Yes, and the management requires her to leave the village every winter. It requires structured removal from triggering environments," he replied. Boone shifted slightly in his chair. Miss Marple turned her attention to him briefly. "Reverend Boone," she said softly, "you mentioned earlier that Mrs. Ashcombe's confessions changed." He nodded uneasily. "Yes. Would you say her emotional narrative changed as well?" He frowned slightly. "In what sense?" "She no longer spoke of her son," Miss Marple said gently. Boone hesitated. "Yes. And before that she did?" "Constantly," he said. "It was central to her grief." Miss Marple nodded, and after she began treatment, silence. Then Boone said quietly, "It was as though the memory no longer had emotional weight." Harwood's voice entered smoothly. "That is expected in recovery." But Miss Marple did not look at him. She was watching Boone now, because Boone had just said something important without realizing it. "Not weight," she repeated softly. Boone blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "You said the memory lost emotional weight," she clarified. "Not that it disappeared." "Yes," Boone said slowly. "That is correct." Miss Marple leaned back slightly. "And yet," she said, "in true grief, memories do not lose weight. They accumulate it." A silence followed, not uncomfortable, structural. Then she added softly, "They only lose weight when something is adjusting them." Boone frowned. "Adjusting them, yes," Miss Marple said gently, "like a scale being recalibrated." Harwood's fingers, resting near his glass, were perfectly still, too still. Miss Marple turned her gaze toward him. "Doctor," she said quietly, "how exactly is Mrs. Ashcombe's condition managed during winter?" A pause, not long, but measured. "She receives monitored care," he replied. "Where?" A slight hesitation. "At a residential facility," he said. "And this facility," Miss Marple continued, "has a consistent name?" Harwood's voice remained steady. "Yes," Miss Marple nodded. "And who operates it?" A fraction of silence. Then, "A trust." "Named after you," she said softly. Boone looked between them now, unease sharpening. Harwood did not deny it, but neither did he confirm immediately. Instead, he said carefully, "The trust is administrative. It exists to ensure continuity of care." "Continuity," Miss Marple repeated. "Yes, and Mrs. Ashcombe always returns in March," she said. "Correct. Always the same person?" A pause. "Yes." The word was careful now. Too careful. Miss Marple studied him for a long moment. Then she said something that changed the temperature of the room. "Even when she is not the same person who left." Boone frowned. "What do you mean?" But Harwood did not ask, because he understood. Miss Marple continued quietly. "You said her memory changes after treatment," she said. "Not disappears, changes." Boone nodded slowly. "Yes, and each winter she leaves distressed." "Yes, and each spring she returns." Stable. Yes? Miss Marple's expression softened slightly. Then the question, she said, is not where she goes. A pause. But no one spoke. It is what happens to her while she is away. Silence deepened. Outside, wind pressed against the windows again, harder now, as though responding to the conversation itself. Harwood finally spoke. "She is treated," he said. Miss Marple looked at him directly. "And her grief?" she asked. A fraction of hesitation. "Managed," the word again. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes," she said quietly. "That is what I thought." She stood, and this time neither man attempted to stop her. But before she left, she added softly, almost to herself, "Grief does not disappear when managed, Doctor. It only becomes reassigned." That night, Miss Marple did not sleep. Instead, she wrote nothing down. She did not need to, because the pattern had completed itself, and now for the first time she could see what the village had been participating in without ever naming it. Eleanor Ashcombe was not simply being cared for. She was being reset. And each winter, Blackmere Hollow was quietly forgetting her all over again. Not because she left, but because someone ensured she returned as someone new. Chapter 8. The Candle Beside the Dead. Morning arrived without softness. The snow no longer fell in gentle accumulation but in directionless bursts, as though the sky itself had lost patience with the village below. Blackmere Hollow looked less buried than corrected, its edges sharpened, its paths erased with greater intention than before. Miss Marple stood at her window for a long time before moving. There were moments in investigation, she had learned, when silence was not absence of progress, but its most important form. When the mind, having gathered enough fragments, required stillness in order to assemble them without interference. When she finally descended to the inn's breakfast room, Dr. Harwood was already present. Of course he was. He always arrived early enough to appear coincidental, yet never late enough to appear absent. He greeted her with the same composed warmth as before, though something in his manner had subtly changed. Not tension, not fatigue, rather containment, as though certain thoughts had begun requiring more effort to keep inside their proper boundaries. "Miss Marple," he said, "I trust you slept well." "I find," she replied gently, "that sleep is not always the most useful companion when one is considering patterns." A faint pause, then he smiled. "I imagine you consider many patterns." "Yes," she said, "when they repeat often enough." He did not respond immediately. Instead, he poured tea with precise movements, too precise. Across the room, Inspector Graves sat reviewing notes with the distracted heaviness of a man increasingly aware that certainty was becoming harder to maintain. Miss Marple took her seat near the window. Outside, two villagers were speaking in low tones beside the postbox. Their conversation was indistinct, but their body language was not. One leaned forward, the other repeatedly glanced toward Ashcombe Manor's direction. Always that direction, always the same absence pretending to be geography. Harwood sat opposite her without invitation, as though the arrangement had been pre-established. "About yesterday evening," he said calmly. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "I believe there is some misunderstanding regarding my comments." "Do you?" she asked politely. A brief silence. Then he continued. "Mrs. Ashcombe's condition is complex. Any impression of inconsistency in treatment is simply due to the cyclical nature of her illness." "Cyclical," Miss Marple repeated softly. "Yes. And the cycle always ends in March." "Correct." Miss Marple nodded slightly. "And begins in December." "Yes." "And always requires her to be removed from the village entirely." Harwood's gaze held steady. "Yes." Miss Marple folded her hands. "That is quite an efficient cycle," she said. a faint tightening at the corner of his expression. Yes, he agreed. Almost, she continued gently, as though it has been designed. A pause, not immediate denial, not immediate acceptance, a measured recalibration. Then Harwood said, "Medical systems are designed." "Of course," Miss Marple replied. Silence settled between them. Not empty. Observed. After a moment, she added quietly, "Tell me, doctor, when you speak of treatment, you are referring to medication?" "Yes." "And observation?" "Yes." "And memory regulation?" A fraction of hesitation. "Yes," he said again. Miss Marple's gaze did not move. "Memory regulation," she repeated. Harwood nodded once. "As part of trauma recovery protocols." Inspector Graves looked up sharply from his papers at that phrase, but said nothing. Miss Marple, however, did not react outwardly. Instead, she simply allowed the words to exist in the room long enough to reveal their shape. Memory regulation, not healing, not recovery. Regulation. She leaned back slightly. "I see," she said softly. Harwood studied her carefully now, perhaps for the first time, not as a polite observer, but as something requiring management. "You seem to be drawing conclusions," he said. "I am," she replied. "And may I ask what those conclusions are?" Miss Marple looked toward the window. Snow pressed against the glass in uneven layers, obscuring the village beyond. "I think," she said quietly, "that Mrs. Ashcombe's life has been arranged in such a way that she can never remain the same person for very long." A silence followed. Inspector Graves frowned. "What does that mean exactly?" But Harwood did not ask, because he already understood the direction of thought. Miss Marple continued, still gentle. "Each winter she disappears," she said, "and each spring she returns, stable, functional, reintegrated." "Yes," Harwood said, "but stability," she added softly, "is often simply the absence of remembered disturbance." A pause. "And if memory itself is altered," she said, "then what exactly is being restored each year?" The room felt still. Even the fire seemed to hesitate. Harwood's voice remained calm, but now carried a different weight. "Mrs. Ashcombe receives therapeutic intervention," he said carefully. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "But intervention," she continued, "implies interference." A longer silence now, not uncomfortable, critical. Inspector Graves shifted in his seat. "You are suggesting manipulation," he said slowly. "I am suggesting," Miss Marple replied, "that the pattern is too precise to be natural." Harwood set his cup down. The sound was quiet, but deliberate. "Miss Marple," he said evenly, "you are interpreting clinical procedure through emotional inference." "Am I?" she asked softly. "Yes." She regarded him for a long moment, then said, almost gently, "Doctor, I noticed something at the chapel." A faint stillness returned. Harwood did not move. "The candle," she continued. Inspector Graves frowned. "What about it?" Miss Marple did not look at him. She was watching Harwood now. "It was placed too carefully," she said. "Not as part of ritual, but as part of correction." Harwood's expression did not change, but something beneath it did, very slightly. "And what would that correction be?" he asked. Miss Marple's voice lowered. "To make the scene appear consistent with expectation." A pause. "And yet," she added, "the expectation itself was constructed." Silence. Outside, wind struck the window more sharply now, rattling the frame slightly. Inspector Graves looked increasingly uncertain. "I do not follow," he admitted. Miss Marple turned to him briefly. "You saw a woman who had wandered into the cold," she said. "Yes, but the shepherd did not say he found a body," she continued softly. "He said he found a woman." Graves frowned. "That is semantics." "No," she said gently. "It is perception." She turned back to Harwood. And perception, she said quietly, can be guided. Harwood finally spoke again. His voice remained calm, but something in it had narrowed. "You are suggesting," he said, "that Mrs. Ashcomb's condition is being fabricated." "I am suggesting," Miss Marple replied, "that it is being maintained." A silence followed. He studied her carefully now, not with irritation, but assessment. And then, very quietly, he said, "That is a dangerous interpretation." Miss Marple nodded slightly. "Yes," she agreed, "it would be." A pause. Then she added, "Unless it were true." The fire cracked sharply in the hearth. Inspector Graves opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came immediately. Harwood remained still, perfectly composed. But now, Miss Marple noticed, the stillness was no longer effortless. It was maintained, and in that distinction, subtle, almost invisible, lay the first true fracture. She stood slowly. "I think," she said softly, "I will visit Ashcombe Manor again." Harwood looked up. "For what purpose?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "To see what remains," she said. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "When a pattern becomes too perfect, Doctor, one begins to wonder what has been removed to make it so." And as she left the room, she did not look back, but she felt it, the smallest shift behind her, not movement, adjustment, as though something in Dr. Julian Harwood had just begun, for the first time, to calculate what could no longer be safely left unexamined. Chapter 9. A Man Who Needed Sorrow. Ashcombe Manor felt different in daylight. Not warmer, not brighter, simply more exposed, as though night had previously offered it the mercy of ambiguity, and morning had removed that protection with quiet indifference. Miss Marple stood at the gate for a long moment before entering. The snow here had been disturbed recently, not by weather, but by passage. Footprints overlapped in irregular patterns, some partially erased, others pressed deeply into the ground, as though made by someone moving with urgency disguised as calm. The housekeeper did not answer the door immediately. When she did appear, Mrs. Lorne looked older than she had only days before, not physically, structurally, as though something within her had begun to lose alignment. "You should not be here," she said quietly. Miss Marple smiled gently. "I often find I should be precisely where people think I should not." A pause. Then the door opened. Inside, the manor no longer resembled a preserved memory. It resembled a system recently interrupted, a chair slightly askew, a curtain not fully drawn, a clock ticking unevenly in the hallway as though uncertain of its own rhythm. Miss Marple noticed all of it without comment. Mrs. Lorne led her into the sitting room, though her movements lacked their previous rehearsed steadiness. "She is not here," the housekeeper said again. "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly. "I am aware," a hesitation. Then Mrs. Lorne added, almost reluctantly, "Dr. Harwood said not to disturb anything." Miss Marple paused. "That is interesting," she said. The housekeeper stiffened slightly. "I mean only," Miss Marple continued gently, "that instructions are often given when someone wishes to preserve arrangement rather than truth." Mrs. Lorne said nothing. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the mantelpiece. The photograph of the child remained in its place. Thomas, the boy beneath the ice. But now she noticed something she had not seen before. A second frame behind it, partially concealed. She reached out and carefully shifted the front photograph. The second image revealed itself slowly, not immediately clear, then unmistakable. Eleanor Ashcombe standing beside the frozen pond, but not as the village remembered her. Her expression was not grief, not shock, but distance, as though she were observing something happening to someone else. Miss Marple did not touch the frame for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "This was taken on the day of the accident." Mrs. Lorne's voice was barely audible. "Yes, and she was present." "Yes." Miss Marple turned slightly. "And yet," she said softly, "the village narrative suggests she arrived after." Mrs. Lorne swallowed. "That is what Dr. Harwood said," she replied. "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. There it was again. Not truth, instruction. She turned away from the photographs and moved toward the corridor. Mrs. Lorne followed hesitantly. "You must not go upstairs," she said suddenly. Miss Marple paused. "Why not?" A silence, not uncertainty, conflict. Finally Mrs. Lorne said, "Because that is where she used to be. Before." Miss Marple studied her carefully. Before what? But the housekeeper did not answer. Instead, she looked toward the upper floor, as though afraid it might hear her speaking. Miss Marple ascended anyway. Each step carried a faint sound of old wood adjusting under pressure. The corridor above was dim, not from lack of light, but from deliberate restraint of it. Curtains drawn too precisely. Doors closed too evenly. Order imposed rather than natural. At the end of the hallway stood a door slightly ajar. Miss Marple approached it slowly. Behind her, Mrs. Lorne did not follow. The room inside was simple, almost clinical. A bed neatly made, a chair positioned at exact right angles to the window, and on the table beside it, a small stack of papers. Miss Marple stepped closer. The top sheet bore handwriting, Eleanor Ashcombe's name, but beneath it, not a letter, not a diary, a schedule, rows of dates, each marked in identical handwriting. December departure, January observation, February stabilization, March return, and beside each entry, a signature, not Eleanor's, Dr. Julian Harwood. Miss Marple did not move for several seconds. Then she turned another page, and another. The pattern repeated, year after year. But what changed, what shifted subtly across time, was not the structure, it was the wording. Early entries described illness, later entries described management, later still, reorientation. She closed the folder gently. Outside the room, the wind struck the house more forcefully, as though attempting to interrupt thought itself. Then she noticed something else. A second set of documents beneath the stack. Lighter paper, different handwriting. Eleanor's. Not formal, not structured, fragmented. One line read, "I do not remember arriving." Another, "They say I leave every winter, but I only remember going to sleep." And then, "I trust him because he remembers for me." Miss Marple's breath remained steady, but something in the room had changed. Not physically, perceptually, because now the pattern was no longer abstract. It was personal. She turned slowly toward the window. Snow pressed against the glass in uneven layers, and beyond it, Ashcombe Manor looked less like a house now, more like a boundary, something marking the edge between memory and construction. Behind her, a voice spoke quietly. "You should not have found that." Miss Marple did not turn immediately. She already knew who it was. Dr. Julian Harwood stood in the doorway, still composed, still measured. But now there was no warmth in the expression, only containment. "I suspected you might come here," he said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently. "I imagine you did." A pause. Then he stepped into the room, not hurried, not aggressive, deliberate. "You misunderstand what you are seeing," he said calmly. "Do I?" she asked. "Yes." Miss Marple looked at him for a long moment, then said quietly, "Doctor, what happens to Mrs. Ashcombe during winter?" A faint tightening at his jaw. "She receives treatment," he said. "Yes," she replied. I have seen that word, and I have seen another, she said softly. Reorientation. A silence followed. Harwood did not deny it, but something in his stillness shifted, very slightly, as though maintaining composure now required conscious effort. You are interpreting clinical terminology incorrectly, he said. No, Miss Marple replied gently. I am observing consistency. A pause. Then she added, and inconsistency elsewhere. He looked at her more directly now. Such as... Miss Marple turned slightly toward the documents. Such as a woman who believes she loses time every winter, she said softly, because someone ensures she never remembers it correctly. The silence that followed was different now, not observational, defensive. Harwood spoke more quietly. You are suggesting fabrication. I am suggesting design, she corrected. A long pause. Then, very softly, she added, and you have been maintaining it for years. Something in his expression finally fractured, not dramatically, but enough to reveal what had been contained beneath professional calm. Exhaustion, not physical, emotional, deep, as though holding a structure upright for too long had begun to require parts of himself he no longer wished to offer. You do not understand what she is without it, he said quietly. Miss Marple studied him. That, she said gently, is the most revealing thing you have said. A silence. Then Harwood stepped slightly closer. Not threatening, but unguarded. She cannot carry it, he said. She never could. And so you carry it for her, Miss Marple replied. Yes, he said simply. The word was not defensive. It was resigned. Outside, the wind pressed harder against the manor. Snow thickened, and for the first time Miss Marple understood not just the structure of the deception, but its emotional architecture. Harwood did not believe he was controlling Eleanor Ashcombe. He believed he was preserving her. From memory, from grief, from the child beneath the ice. And in doing so, he had ensured she would never be the same person twice. Miss Marple looked at him quietly. And each winter, she said softly, you make her forget. A pause. Yes, he admitted. A longer silence. Then Miss Marple said the final question. And each spring? Harwood did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was almost barely audible. Each spring, he said, she survives it again. And in that moment, Miss Marple finally understood the true horror of the pattern. Eleanor Ashcombe was not disappearing. She was being returned, not healed, not freed, rewritten. Final chapter, when the snow finally remembers. The wind outside Ashcombe Manor had become less weather and more argument. It pressed against the windows with a persistence that felt almost deliberate, as though the world itself had grown tired of secrecy and was now insisting on participation. Snow gathered in uneven sheets along the sill, melting and freezing again in slow cycles that mirrored something far older than the storm. Inside, the air was still, not peaceful, contained. Miss Marple stood in the upper room where Eleanor Ashcombe's documents lay open, though she no longer needed them. The papers had served their purpose. What remained now was not evidence, but understanding. Quiet, structured, and unsettling in its clarity. Dr. Julian Harwood remained by the doorway. He had not moved since speaking last, and yet, for the first time, he no longer looked like a man in control of a system. He looked like a man standing inside one. You believe, he said quietly, that I have harmed her. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Outside, a branch struck the window once, lightly, like a hesitant knock from the landscape itself. I believe, she said at last, that you have been protecting her in a way that required her to stop belonging to herself. A pause. Harwood exhaled slowly. That is not the same thing. No, Miss Marple agreed gently. It is not. Silence followed. Then she turned slightly toward him. You are a man who understands patterns, she said. I am a doctor, he replied. Yes, she said softly, and also someone who noticed a pattern in a child's death that the village preferred not to examine too closely. Something shifted in his expression, not denial, recognition, Miss Marple continued calmly. Thomas Ashcombe did not simply wander onto the ice, she said. That was always an incomplete explanation. Children do not act in isolation when emotion is fractured around them. A faint tightening at Harwood's jaw. Miss Marple stepped closer to the window. The day of the accident, she said. Eleanor was not absent. She was present, but not attentive. There was a quarrel, a disruption, emotional dislocation, and a child, seeking stability, moves toward what feels familiar. Her voice remained steady, as children do. A long silence. Harwood's voice came quieter now. You are reconstructing speculation. No, she said softly. I am reconstructing behavior. She turned slightly toward him, and the village chose a simpler version because it allowed grief to settle into a single shape. A pause. But grief rarely stays in single shapes, she added. It expands, it distorts, it seeks explanation where none is comfortable. Harwood looked away briefly, not in guilt, in exhaustion. Miss Marple continued. You, however, did not accept the village's version. His eyes returned to her. No, he said quietly. You saw something else. Yes. And what you saw, she said gently, was a woman collapsing under a memory she could not hold, a silence. Then, more softly, and you mistook that collapse for something you could manage. Harwood's voice was barely audible now. I tried to stop it from destroying her. Miss Marple nodded slightly. I believe you did. A pause. And in doing so, she continued, you began separating her from the very memory that defined her. Outside, the storm shifted again, less violent now, more steady, as though listening. You created a cycle, Miss Marple said. Each winter, she is taken away from the place where memory is strongest. Each spring, she is returned without the full weight of what she experienced. Harwood closed his eyes briefly. She could not live with it intact, he said. And so you ensured she never had to, Miss Marple replied. A long silence. Then she said quietly, but memory is not erased by absence. It is fragmented. She turned slightly toward him. And fragments do not disappear. They accumulate in other forms. Harwood's voice broke slightly. Then what would you have had me do? It was the first time his composure had truly faltered. Not in anger, in desperation. Miss Marple regarded him for a long moment, then said softly, let her remember. A pause. But she would have broken, he said. Yes, she agreed. And you could not accept that? No, she said gently. You could not. Silence settled again. Thicker now. He stepped slowly into the room, not approaching her, not retreating, just standing. You think I controlled her, he said quietly. I think, Miss Marple replied, you became essential to her stability in a way that removed her ability to define herself without you. A faint laugh escaped him, not amused, strained. So I am the villain in your interpretation. Miss Marple shook her head gently. No, she said. Villains believe they are justified. You believed you were necessary. A pause. That is more dangerous. Outside, the wind finally eased, and in that easing, something inside the house seemed to shift as well. Not physically, but emotionally, as though long-held tension had begun to loosen its grip. Harwood spoke again, quieter now. She used to wake in winter and not remember who she had been in summer, he said. Do you know what that does to a person? Yes, Miss Marple said softly. It makes them rely on whoever fills the gap. A silence. And you filled it, she added. Harwood nodded faintly. Yes. Miss Marple turned toward the table where Eleanor's papers lay. She wrote something, she said. Harwood did not respond. Miss Marple picked up the fragment carefully. She said, I trust him because he remembers for me. A pause. That is not trust, she added gently. That is surrender. Harwood closed his eyes again. For a moment, he said nothing. Then quietly, she could not hold it. Miss Marple nodded. And so you held it for her? Yes. And in holding it, she said softly, you began deciding what she was allowed to be. Silence. Then Harwood spoke, barely audible. I did not want her to suffer. Miss Marple looked at him. No, she said gently. You did not want to witness her suffering without meaning. That landed differently. He looked at her then, not as authority, but as someone seen, and in that moment something in him finally stopped resisting. She was breaking, he said quietly. Every winter, the same collapse, the same grief, the same child. A pause. I could not allow it to remain untouched. Miss Marple nodded. And so you touched it. Silence, then softer, and in touching it, you altered it. He did not deny it, because there was nothing left to deny. The room felt suddenly quieter, as though the storm outside had finally withdrawn enough to allow truth to be heard, without interference. Miss Marple stepped closer to him now, not confrontationally, simply present. You did not kill her, she said gently. A pause. But you did something else. Harwood looked at her. What? He asked. Miss Marple's voice softened further. You made her survival dependent on forgetting. A long silence followed. Then Harwood whispered, Is that worse? Miss Marple considered this carefully, then replied, It is more human. A pause, but also more fragile. Downstairs, footsteps echoed faintly. She turned slightly toward Harwood. Tell me, she said gently, when she returned each March, did she ever ask questions? He hesitated. Yes, he said. And you answered them. Yes. Always consistently? Yes. Miss Marple nodded. And did she ever remember asking them before? A pause. Harwood's voice softened. No. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, then opened them. There it is, she said quietly. Harwood frowned slightly. What? She looked at him gently. The true mechanism. A silence. Then she explained slowly. You did not simply manage her illness, she said. You maintained continuity of identity by removing contradiction. A pause. You ensured she never encountered evidence of her own instability. Harwood listened. Still now, fully now. And so, she continued, she could not integrate memory, only experience, a quiet breath. And experience without integration, she said softly, does not become identity. It becomes repetition. Harwood whispered, a cycle. Yes, Miss Marple said, but not a natural one. Outside, the last remnants of the storm began. Light, thin and uncertain, filtered through the clouds, and with it came something neither of them had expected to feel in this place. Stillness. Real stillness, not managed, not constructed, just present. Harwood spoke finally, almost to himself. I thought I was preserving her. Miss Marple looked at him kindly. "I know." A pause. "And perhaps," she added gently, "you were preserving something else as well." He looked at her. "What?" Miss Marple answered quietly. "Your ability to live with what happened to the child." Silence. The name did not need to be spoken again. It was already everywhere. Harwood's expression shifted then, not breaking, but releasing, slowly, as though something long held had finally found permission to rest. When Inspector Graves finally entered the room, the truth had already settled. Not dramatically, not explosively, but quietly, like snow finally ceasing to fall. Epilogue. The winter that was remembered. Blackmere Hollow did not recover quickly. It never did. Villages do not recover from truth in the way cities do. Cities overwrite. Villages remember. There were inquiries, formal statements, carefully constructed conclusions. Dr. Julian Harwood did not resist arrest. He did not attempt justification in public. Only once, quietly, did he speak to Miss Marple before leaving Ashcombe Manor for the final time. "I did not change who she was," he said. Miss Marple looked at him. "No," she replied softly. "You changed how she survived herself." He nodded once and said nothing more. Eleanor Ashcombe's funeral was small, not because the village did not care, but because they were uncertain what, exactly, they were mourning. A woman, a cycle, a version of grief itself. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the churchyard as snow finally began to melt in hesitant streams along the stone paths. Reverend Boone read softly from Scripture, though his voice carried less certainty than before. Afterward, Miss Marple walked alone toward the frozen pond. It was thawing now, slowly, reluctantly, as though even the ice had grown accustomed to holding memory. She stood there for a long time, thinking not of guilt, but of fragility, because what she had learned was not simply how deception functioned, but how easily it could be mistaken for care when it was applied with enough consistency, and how easily care could become control when it refused to accept loss. Behind her, the village resumed its slow movement, not healed, but altered. And as Miss Marple finally turned back toward Blackmere Hollow, she thought, not for the first time, that truth rarely arrives like justice. It arrives like weather, and like weather, it changes everything without asking permission. The snow had not vanished, but it no longer concealed, and that, she reflected quietly, was enough for one winter to finally end.